What if I told you that the most inspiring revolution in human history became the blueprint for one of the most terrifying collapses of civilization? What if the nation that once stood as a beacon of freedom and equality descended into such darkness that even Hollywood couldn't imagine the horrors that unfolded behind closed doors? Tonight, we're diving into the story of Haiti. A story that textbooks sanitize, that documentaries gloss over, and that governments prefer you never fully understand. Because the truth about what happened on this Caribbean island doesn't just challenge everything you think you know about revolution and freedom. It reveals something far more disturbing about human nature, power, and the thin line between liberation and absolute terror. You've heard the inspiring version. Enslaved people rising up, breaking their chains, defeating Napoleon's armies, creating the first free Black republic in the world. It's a story of triumph that echoes through history, inspiring countless freedom movements across the globe. But what happened next? What transformed this symbol of hope into a cautionary tale so dark that it's whispered about in hushed tones? The answer involves secret societies practicing ancient rituals in presidential palaces, dictators who claim to speak with the dead, mass graves hidden beneath luxury hotels, and a spiral of violence so extreme that survivors still refuse to speak about what they witnessed. We're talking about voodoo politics, zombie armies, and a reign of terror that makes medieval torture chambers look civilized. But here's what will shock you most. The seeds of Haiti's destruction weren't planted by foreign enemies or natural disasters. They were planted by the very heroes who fought for its freedom. The revolution that inspired the world contained within it the genetic code for its own apocalypse. Before we dive deep into this rabbit hole of human darkness, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, after tonight's story, you'll want to know what other buried truths we're going to uncover. And drop a comment below. Have you ever wondered why some revolutions create lasting freedom while others descend into chaos? Your thoughts might surprise you. Let me paint you a picture of Paradise Lost. Picture the year 1804. The world is watching in awe as something unprecedented unfolds on the island of Hispaniola. For the first time in human history, enslaved people have not just rebelled, but completely overthrown their masters, defeated the most powerful military force in the world, and declared themselves free. This wasn't just any uprising. This was a revolution that struck terror into the hearts of every slave owner, from Virginia to Brazil, every colonial power from London to Madrid. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue, as Haiti was then known, had achieved the impossible. They had broken the chains that had bound millions of Africans for centuries and created something the world had never seen before: a republic founded by former slaves, governed by Black leaders, standing as equals among the nations of the world. The revolution had been led by extraordinary men. Toussaint Louverture, the self-educated former slave who outmaneuvered French generals with military genius that would have impressed Napoleon himself. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the ruthless general who completed what Toussaint began, proclaiming independence and taking the title of Emperor Jacques I. Henri Christophe, who would later crown himself King Henri I of Haiti, building magnificent palaces that rivaled Versailles. These were not savage rebels as their enemies portrayed them. They were sophisticated political leaders who understood diplomacy, military strategy, and statecraft. They established a constitution that guaranteed freedom and equality for all citizens, regardless of color. They created institutions, built schools, established trade relationships with foreign nations. They even welcomed white settlers who accepted the new order, proving that their revolution was about freedom, not revenge. The new Haiti was proclaimed as a beacon of hope for oppressed people everywhere. Its constitution declared that all citizens, regardless of their origin, would be considered black in the eyes of the law, symbolically embracing everyone under the banner of freedom. Foreign observers marveled at the transformation. Former slaves were governing themselves, creating art, engaging in commerce, building a civilization that confounded every racist assumption about African capabilities. For a brief, shining moment, Haiti stood as proof that the ideals of the Enlightenment could transcend race, that liberty and equality were not reserved for white Europeans, that human dignity was truly universal. The world had never seen anything like it, and many hoped it was the dawn of a new age of human freedom. But even as Haiti celebrated its independence, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. The revolution's leaders, having achieved the impossible, now faced an even more daunting challenge. How do you build a nation from the ashes of a slave colony? How do you govern a population that had known only oppression? How do you create prosperity when the entire world is determined to see you fail? The answers to these questions would determine whether Haiti's revolution would inspire lasting change or become a cautionary tale about the price of freedom. And the answers, as we're about to discover, were far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. But first, let's be clear about what Haiti had actually accomplished, because understanding the magnitude of their achievement makes what happened next even more shocking. Now let me tell you what your history textbooks conveniently left out. That shining beacon of freedom I just described, it was built on a foundation of blood that would make the French Revolution's reign of terror look like a polite disagreement. The reality behind Haiti's glorious independence was a racial war of such brutality that even hardened soldiers on both sides were traumatized by what they witnessed. Dessalines, the hero who completed the revolution, didn't just defeat the French. He systematically exterminated virtually every white person remaining on the island. Men, women, children, even those who had supported the revolution. The order was clear: eliminate every trace of the oppressor race. French colonists who had lived on the island for generations were hunted down like animals. Families were dragged from their homes and butchered in the streets. Women and children were thrown into rivers to drown. Entire plantations were burned with their owners still inside. The newly independent Haitian army went from town to town, conducting house-to-house searches, killing anyone with pale skin. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. This wasn't random violence or uncontrolled rage. This was systematic, methodical ethnic cleansing carried out with military precision. Dessalines had learned from his masters, and he applied their own brutal logic with devastating efficiency. If slavery was justified by racial superiority, then freedom could only be secured by racial purity. The massacre lasted for months. Contemporary accounts described rivers running red with blood, dogs feeding on human corpses, and the stench of death hanging over the entire island. Foreign diplomats who witnessed the aftermath reported scenes that haunted them for the rest of their lives. But what made it even more terrifying was how easily the former slaves embraced their role as executioners. Here's what should chill you to the bone. The revolution hadn't just overthrown slavery. It had revealed something far more disturbing about human nature. Given the chance, the oppressed became oppressors with a efficiency that shocked even their enemies. The moral clarity of the fight for freedom had transformed into something much darker, much more complex. And this was just the beginning. Because Dessalines' reign of terror wasn't an aberration. It was setting the template for everything that would follow. The revolution had taught Haiti's leaders that power came from violence, that survival meant eliminating your enemies completely, and that moral principles were luxuries that could be discarded when convenient. Within 2 years of independence, Dessalines had crowned himself Emperor Jacques I, establishing a dynasty that made a mockery of republican ideals. He imposed forced labor that was barely distinguishable from slavery, except now the chains were invisible and the overseers were black. The plantation system that had supposedly been destroyed was quietly rebuilt under new management. When Dessalines was assassinated by his own generals in 1806, it wasn't because they objected to his tyranny. It was because they wanted their turn at absolute power. The revolution had created not freedom, but a new form of oppression, one that would prove far more enduring and far more destructive than anything the French colonists had ever imposed. The pattern was now set. Haiti would be ruled by a succession of dictators, each more paranoid and brutal than the last, each claiming to represent the people while systematically destroying them. The island that had inspired the world with its promise of freedom was about to embark on a 2-century journey into darkness. And the most terrifying part? The Haitian people would not only accept this descent into chaos, they would actively participate in it, embracing leaders who promised them power through ancient rituals and supernatural terror. The revolution had unleashed forces that would consume the nation from within. What do you think drives people to embrace tyranny in the name of freedom? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because what we're about to explore next will challenge everything you believe about revolution, power, and human nature. But to understand how deep this darkness would eventually go, we need to focus on one man whose story embodies Haiti's entire tragic trajectory. A man who began as a revolutionary hero and ended as something far more sinister. A man whose transformation mirrors that of his entire nation. Let me tell you about Henri Christophe, the slave who became a king and whose story reads like a horror novel written by a madman. Born into bondage, Christophe fought alongside Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines in the Revolution, proving himself one of the most capable military commanders in Haitian history. He was intelligent, charismatic, and genuinely committed to building a prosperous black nation that would command respect from the world. When Haiti split into competing kingdoms after Dessalines' assassination, Christophe declared himself King Henri I of northern Haiti. And for a moment, it seemed like he might actually succeed in creating the prosperous black nation that the revolution had promised. He established schools, built roads, created a currency, and even founded a nobility with titles like Duke of Marmalade and Count of Lemonade. Christophe's crowning achievement was the construction of the Citadelle La Ferrière, a massive fortress built into a mountaintop that still stands today as one of the world's most impressive architectural achievements. This wasn't just a military installation. It was a statement to the world that black people could create monuments rivaling anything in Europe. 20,000 workers labored for 16 years to build this impossible structure, hauling massive cannons up vertical cliffs, cementing stones with a mortar mixed with bull's blood and molasses. But here's where Christophe's story takes a turn into madness that foreshadows everything that would follow in Haitian politics. The same man who built schools and promoted education became obsessed with creating a court culture that out-decadented European royalty. He forced his subjects to bow and scrape before him, with elaborate ceremonies that consumed resources his impoverished nation couldn't afford. The king, who had promised prosperity, began demanding impossible tributes from his people. Peasants were forced to surrender their children to build his palaces. Villages were empty to provide workers for his grandiose construction projects. Anyone who questioned his authority simply disappeared in the night, their bodies fed to sharks in the coastal waters. Christophe's paranoia grew with his power. He surrounded himself with spies and informants, trusting no one, seeing enemies everywhere. He established a secret police force that made the French colonial authorities look benevolent by comparison. Torture chambers were built beneath his magnificent palaces, where suspected traitors were subjected to horrors that survivors refused to describe even decades later. But what makes Christophe's story truly disturbing is how he justified his tyranny. He claimed that harsh rule was necessary to prove that black people could govern themselves, that any sign of weakness would invite foreign invasion, that his subjects needed to be forced to be free. The revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality became tools for oppression, twisted into unrecognizable shapes by the corrupting influence of absolute power. The breaking point came when Christophe's own bodyguards, men who had served him faithfully for years, finally realized that their king had become a monster. In 1820, faced with an internal rebellion, Christophe chose to end his reign in a manner that would haunt Haiti's collective memory forever. Rather than face capture, he shot himself through the heart with a silver bullet, but not before ensuring that his death would be as theatrical as his life. Legend says that Christophe's body was soaked in quicklime and rum, then burned in a furnace heated by the wooden furniture from his own throne room. His ashes were scattered from the walls of his great fortress, his final act a symbolic contamination of his own greatest achievement. But Christophe's death didn't end his influence on Haiti. If anything, it established him as the template for every dictator who would follow. His combination of grandiose promises, architectural megalomania, paranoid brutality, and theatrical self-destruction would be repeated by every strongman who seized power on the island. More disturbingly, Christophe's reign demonstrated something that would plague Haiti for the next 2 centuries. The Haitian people seemed willing, even eager, to trade their freedom for the promise of glory. They accepted oppression as long as it came wrapped in the rhetoric of black pride and national greatness. They celebrated their chains as long as those chains were forged by black hands rather than white ones. This willingness to embrace tyranny in the name of racial solidarity would prove to be Haiti's fatal weakness, the flaw that would be exploited by every would-be dictator for the next 200 years. And none would exploit it more effectively or more destructively than the man who would transform Haiti from a failed state into a genuine chamber of horrors. The stage was now set for the arrival of Haiti's ultimate nightmare, a dictator who would make Christophe look like a benevolent father figure, a man who would weaponize the very soul of the Haitian people against them, using their deepest spiritual beliefs as instruments of terror. Are you beginning to see the pattern? How revolutionary ideals can become the foundation for oppression? Drop a comment and let me know what you think drives people to surrender their freedom to leaders who promise them glory. But what we've discussed so far is merely the prologue to Haiti's real descent into hell, because the worst was yet to come. The absolute nadir of human governance was still decades away, waiting to emerge from the marriage of political ambition and ancient spiritual practices that most of the world doesn't even believe exist. In 1957, a country doctor named François Duvalier came to power in Haiti through what appeared to be a democratic election. Papa Doc, as he was known to his people, seemed like exactly what Haiti needed. He was educated, soft-spoken, and promised to represent the interests of Haiti's black majority against the wealthy mulatto elite who had dominated the country's politics since independence. But Papa Doc Duvalier wasn't just another corrupt politician seeking personal enrichment. He was something far more dangerous. He was a true believer in the power of voodoo, and he understood better than any leader before him how to weaponize Haiti's spiritual traditions for political control. Within months of taking power, Duvalier began systematically eliminating anyone who might challenge his authority. But this wasn't ordinary political repression. Duvalier's enemies didn't just disappear. They were subjected to ritualistic torture designed to break not just their bodies, but their souls. Political prisoners were forced to participate in voodoo ceremonies before their execution, their deaths transformed into offerings to the spirits that Duvalier claimed protected his regime. The Tonton Macoutes, Duvalier's secret police force, weren't simply thugs with guns. They were initiated practitioners of voodoo magic, men who wore the dark glasses and formal dress of undertakers, who carried coffins through the streets as warnings to potential dissidents. They didn't just kill their victims. They claimed to steal their souls, transforming them into zombies who would serve the regime even after death. But here's what makes Duvalier's reign truly terrifying. He didn't impose voodoo politics on an unwilling population. The Haitian people embraced it. They participated in it. They became willing accomplices in their own spiritual enslavement. Because Duvalier had tapped into something deeper than political loyalty or fear. He had convinced an entire nation that their survival depended on supernatural forces that only he could control. Duvalier declared himself the earthly representative of Baron Samedi, the voodoo spirit of death and resurrection. He dressed in the spirit's traditional black suit and top hat, spoke in the voice of the dead during public ceremonies, and claimed the power to raise zombies from their graves to serve as his immortal army. Foreign diplomats who attended state functions reported scenes that seemed to come from a horror movie, with Duvalier speaking in tongues while his ministers danced around fires fed with human bones. The palace itself was transformed into a temple of dark magic. Voodoo altars were erected in government offices. State ceremonies included animal sacrifices and spirit possessions. Cabinet meetings began with rituals designed to channel the guidance of ancestral spirits. The line between governance and witchcraft disappeared entirely, creating a system of rule that defied every rational principle of political science. But the most chilling aspect of Duvalier's reign was how effectively he turned the Haitian people against each other. Using voodoo beliefs about spirits and curses, He convinced neighbors to spy on neighbors, children to betray their parents, husbands to denounce their wives. Anyone could be accused of practicing harmful magic against the state. Anyone could be condemned as a spiritual threat to the regime. The result was a reign of terror, unlike anything the world had ever seen. Conservative estimates suggest that Duvalier was responsible for the deaths of 30,000 people, but the true number may be much higher. Bodies were dumped in mass graves, fed to crocodiles, or simply left to rot in the streets as warnings to potential dissidents. The capital city of Port-au-Prince became a charnel house, where death was not just common, but ritualized, transformed into a performance art of political control. Foreign journalists who managed to penetrate Duvalier's Haiti described a nation that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of reality. They reported seeing people who appeared to be walking corpses, shambling through the streets in a zombie-like trance. They witnessed public executions that included elements of human sacrifice. They encountered children who claimed to communicate with the spirits of the dead, passing along messages from their murdered relatives. But perhaps most disturbing of all, they discovered that many Haitians genuinely believed that Duvalier possessed supernatural powers. Even his enemies were convinced that he could curse them from beyond the grave, that his magic was real, that opposing him meant risking not just death, but eternal damnation. The dictator had achieved something that no tyrant in history had ever managed. He had convinced an entire population that he was literally immortal, that his power transcended the physical world. When Papa Doc finally died in 1971, after 14 years of absolute rule, he passed power to his 19-year-old son, Jean-Claude Duvalier, Baby Doc. The dynasty continued, the voodoo politics continued, and Haiti's descent into chaos accelerated. The son proved even more incompetent than the father, combining supernatural tyranny with unprecedented corruption that bled the country dry. By the time Baby Doc was finally overthrown in 1986, Haiti had been transformed into something that barely qualified as a functioning state. The economy had collapsed, the infrastructure had crumbled, and an entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but fear, violence, and spiritual manipulation. The revolution that had begun with such promise had produced a nation of zombies, ruled by dictators who claimed to speak with the dead. And this is where Haiti's story becomes truly apocalyptic, because the fall of the Duvalier didn't end the nightmare. It unleashed forces that would tear the country apart in ways that made the previous decades look stable by comparison. The voodoo politics that Papa Doc had institutionalized had infected every aspect of Haitian society, creating a culture of violence and superstition that would prove almost impossible to eradicate. What followed was a series of coups, invasions, natural disasters, and humanitarian crises that would leave Haiti as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, a failed state where armed gangs practice voodoo rituals over the bodies of their victims, where political leaders still claim supernatural powers, where the promise of the revolution has been so thoroughly corrupted that freedom itself has become a curse. The island that once inspired the world with its vision of human dignity has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing politics with the supernatural, of trading rational governance for the promise of magical solutions to human problems. Haiti today is living proof that some forms of darkness, once unleashed, may be impossible to contain. But the story doesn't end there, because Haiti's influence on the world didn't disappear with its collapse. The ideas that Papa Doc pioneered, the techniques he perfected, the marriage of politics and supernatural belief that he institutionalized, these have spread far beyond the Caribbean. In ways that most people don't realize, Haiti's dark experiment in voodoo politics has become a template for authoritarianism around the world. Today, as we watch strong men rise to power by appealing to ancient fears and supernatural beliefs, as we see rational discourse replaced by conspiracy theories and magical thinking, as we witness entire populations surrendering their freedom to leaders who claim mystical powers, we're seeing the global spread of something that began in Haiti 2 centuries ago. The revolution that promised to liberate humanity from oppression instead created new forms of enslavement that have proven far more durable and far more seductive than anything the old colonial powers ever devised. And the most terrifying part is that we still haven't learned the lesson. We're still susceptible to the same appeals to racial solidarity, spiritual authority, and magical solutions that allowed Haiti's revolutionaries to transform themselves into tyrants. The archives of what really happened during the darkest years of Haiti's descent remain largely sealed. Foreign governments that witnessed these events firsthand have classified their reports, keeping the full truth hidden from public view. Survivors continue to die without sharing their stories, taking their secrets to graves that may themselves be cursed according to local beliefs. Perhaps there are truths about human nature, about the relationship between power and spirituality, about the thin line between liberation and enslavement that the world isn't ready to confront. Perhaps Haiti's story remains unfinished because the forces unleashed by its revolution are still at work, still spreading, still transforming the world in ways we're only beginning to understand. What's certain is that Haiti's transformation from the first free Black republic to a zombie state ruled by voodoo dictators represents one of history's most complete reversals of human progress. It's a story that challenges everything we think we know about revolution, freedom, and the price of human dignity. And it's a story that, despite 2 centuries of horror, may still be writing itself. Before you click away from this video, I want you to do something. I want you to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, because stories like this, stories that challenge conventional wisdom and reveal hidden truths about human nature, these are the stories that the mainstream media won't tell you. And I want you to leave a comment below. What do you think is the most important lesson from Haiti's tragedy? Is it possible for a society to recover from this kind of spiritual and political corruption, or are some forms of darkness permanent? Because understanding what happened in Haiti isn't just about learning history. It's about recognizing the warning signs, the patterns, the seductive appeals that can transform any society from a beacon of hope into a chamber of horrors. And those patterns, those warning signs, they're more relevant today than they've ever been.